Well, gentlemen, since it's all about DUIs or crime and punishment tonight, are you ready?
I got a question before we take an email.
All right. Well,
And
let's
this
hear
is
your
the burning
question.
question that everybody that takes a drink and drives should want to have the answer to. If you have been drinking, and Alan, this is directed towards you, and Alan does a tremendous amount of DUIs, by the way, but if you're drinking and driving, and let's say you know you're pretty close to being a 0.08, you're close to being illegal, and you get pulled over and requested to take any test, whether it be a breath test, a blood test, or a field sobriety test, and you've never had a DUI before, and you're right at that borderline limit in your mind, where you might pass it or you might be over. Alan, what should you do?
Well, there's been a significant change in the law in the last 2 years. 2017, we had the case of Olivic, and basically the holding in Olivic is that the state of Georgia and the prosecution of your case cannot enforce you or compel you to take a breathalyzer test. And that's number one. And then with Elliott, which basically ruled that the unconstitutionality of the implied consent. So I would say that number one is you're already intoxicated. I don't think you can make a real good decision about whether or not you'll be between 0.08 and 0.07. So because the prosecution cannot bring up the matter of the refusal and to use it against you, then I would say at this time that the best thing to do is to not to take the test and to refuse any type of breathalyzer test. Now, this law is not applicable to blood tests and to urine tests, but for them to obtain a blood test, for the prosecution to obtain, the arresting officer to obtain a blood test, then you either have to consent, which you do not need to do, or they will have to obtain a search warrant from a judge, which will take time, and then maybe by that time, your level will go down. So I think I would just, as far as the breath test, I would just refuse.
Wow, so you can do that. I never knew you could actually refuse a breathalyzer test. It's good to know.
Well, thank you. Let me tell you about that. Mm-hmm. The other side of the coin is when you receive a DUI, then they have what we call a DPS 1205, which the state patrol or the county or law enforcement will take your driver's license, and you will have to drive on this temporary license, and you have to appeal your suspension within a certain period of time, and then they set up what we call an administrative license suspension. And if you refuse your tests in the ALS suspension, which is a civil case, then they can use your refusal in that civil case. And if the court finds against you, if the judge finds against you, then your license are what we call a hard suspension for 12 months. But if you have your charges reduced by the prosecution, or you are found not guilty in a court of law, then that's when that suspension would come off. So there is ramifications on the refusal, especially in the civil aspect of the case with the administrative license suspension here.
So it's kind of a catch-22. You're going to end up being suspended if you refuse.
Well, those ALS hearings, the officer represents himself, and basically what that means is it's very few and far between that you prevail on an ALS hearing. And so if the judge finds against you, then you've got a hard suspension. But I think the main thing to do is this also, if at the time of arrest, they're going to say, well, will you comply with, these field sobriety tests, the walk and turn, one leg stand, the horizontal gaze, the nystagmus. I would not take any of those because the officers just gathering evidence against you to use in a court of law in the main trial of the criminal case. And so I think that I would refuse all tests that they ask you to take because, you know, and plus, you know, the officer is one that's basically grading the test. And so
very subjective, and what he says is the way it is. But I guess a lot of them are recorded, aren't they, Alan?
Almost all of them are nowadays.
Yeah.
And because and I think it's good that they are recorded. The criminal defense DUI bar, they promoted having recordings in all cars, and I think we were pretty successful in that because then they are objective findings by the officer, but then the jury can look at it also now and not just the officer.
Now, Alan, one of the things that I think the viewers need to understand, and that is, how long do you have to appeal your case once you're given that DUI and a temporary license?
Well,
if you don't do anything, you're going to end up, as I understand it, you're going to end up losing your license immediately if you don't appeal. But you have a right to appeal the administrative license.
Right. And what you have to do is you have to file your appeal, number one. I would file that immediately, as in.
I mean, how long you have? Is it 10 business days or
something like that? And that's number one. And and you have to also have a fee of $150, and then they will set up the hearing before an administrative license suspension judge. And they are traveling judges that travel the state, and the ALS hearing office is in Atlanta, but then they'll be in Statesboro, Evans, Georgia, Milledgeville, and like if you're in Sandersville or if you're in Edenton or that area, then you'll have to go to Milledgeville, like to the courthouse, to have this hearing.